You know what? What goes on with our money isn't always convenient with the timing of what goes on with our life. What do I mean? Maybe you're trying to save for your kids' college and then the stock market doesn't cooperate right before they go to school. Or maybe you're not as lucky as George Steinbrenner, who owned the Yankees. He died the year there were no estate taxes. Of course he did, the Yankee way. But what happens if it sunsets and it goes all the way down to $675,000 is what it used to be, where the estate tax kicked in. And then there was a year he died where there was no estate tax. You could pass on hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Or what happens if you're retired and the stock market isn't cooperating or the bond market isn't cooperating, or you want to leave your kids with something where they're not always stuck jumping through every hoop with a bank, hoping that they're going to get their first home. People are really worried. Will my child ever be able to afford a home? Well, there is a process and a plan that can help you get there. We're going to talk about that. I brought in a PhD, all right? I brought in a PhD. When I saw you speak a couple of years ago, or maybe it was just a year ago, I was like, you're so clear about something and so technical about it at the same time that some people can, like, I'm really good at philosophically talking about things. Yeah. I have proven it out with the numbers a long time ago and don't really use the numbers as often right now and doing the math behind it like I used to. But you actually brought that where you're like, let me show you the data. And it really drove home some pretty critical points. So Tom Wall wrote Permission to Spend, phenomenal book. I actually rarely do this, but I went on and I endorsed it, unsolicited on Amazon, because I'm like, this is a book everybody should read to help them increase their cash flow in the future from the choices they make today.
Yep.
Really helpful.
Appreciate that. Yeah, that's it's been basically my life's work. I've spent my entire 21-year career either as an advisor or coaching advisors on this, and a lot of that research came from, or really twofold. First, it was early in the business. I was like, am I just a salesman? Do I have just a good sales pitch here for a product that's pretty good, or is this actually the best thing that my clients should be doing? Which led me down my academic career. And then toward these later years where I'm on airplanes every week now, talking to advisors all over the country, and it's very much trying to get, and why I'm so technical is try to get them to see academically, mathematically why this stuff makes so much sense for clients to get that buy-in. And I've been astounded by the results as I've dug into the numbers. I really believe this is the best kept secret in personal finance. I think it's overlooked because it's called life insurance. And there's all these new sexy designs out there that sound better and they're easier to sell. But this stuff that was invented 150, 200 years ago, it has stood the test of time.
Worked in multiple ways, right?
As you've written over and over about.
Multiple economies. So I put policies on my kids as soon as they were 30 days old. And part of it was I'm just worried about everything from inflation. I'm worried about the devaluation of the dollar. I'm worried about fluctuating interest rates. I mean, I just couldn't believe nor could I have predicted that interest rates would keep going down and be as low as they got clear out in 2021, right? So low. I mean, 2% on mortgages that were fixed for 15 and 30 years. That's crazy. I mean, it's just so low. Now we're watching the opposite effect. We're watching inflation, and they're battling it by, raising interest rates, which, I mean, they created the problem, then they create the solution. So it's, I'm a little suspect of the whole thing. But ultimately, my wife gets a little nervous sometimes. Just like, man, you think our kids are going to be able to afford a home? I'm like, well, definitely, because we've already saved up a lot to help them with the down payment that's in an account for their benefit.
Right.
We own the account, but it's on them. And we started at an early time. And so I also look, I don't know what happens the year I die or when I die. There could be economic turmoil. There could be a lot of things that are going on. There could be massive taxation. But I like that I have a death benefit that helps create this buffer. Mm-hmm. When that comes in, and that comes in tax-free, it can help erase bad economies. It can help make up for some mistakes I make along the way, because I've made financial mistakes along the way. Yeah. I mean, I've had some financial wins and a lot more wins than losses, but I've taken some pretty good losses. Had a lot of real estate back in the day and got fed a lot of problems in 2008. Mm-hmm. I've invested in certain things that were, like oil and gas that didn't work out all that well. I invested in some stocks that worked, some that didn't. Like, I don't do all that anymore, but that took a long time to recover from a lot of my real estate woes and get to the other side of that. And the nice thing is the whole time I was like, well, at least I have these policies.
Right.
At least I have these policies, which have been my never fail me strategy, which helped me get to the other side and not declare bankruptcy. because I had cash value, where other people were completely exhausted because they had everything tied up into these assets that were illiquid. Their net worth is dropping. They couldn't liquidate it fast enough, and they weren't having enough cash flow. So I had this way to bridge to the other side and then replenish it over time where, if I would have had that in a qualified plan, like a 401k, that would have been really problematic because the market just tanked at that time.
Yeah. Well, one of the concepts I got so fascinated about when I started not when I started in the business, but a few years in, was the concept of what they call buffer assets.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've all been, everyone talks to you about the stock market and how just stay the course, and over time it's always going to be fine.
You're in for the long haul. Set it and forget it.
And that may be true on average for everybody, but you're not an average over 100 years across millions of people. You're you. So you may retire in the year when the market goes down 50%. It lost 37% in the S&P 500 in 2008. Well, if you go peak to trough, like the end of 2007 to the beginning of 2009, it was actually like half that you lost. And if you have to live, if you have to live on those assets, or even if you're younger and you want to use assets opportunistically, well, guess what? Now you have to sell low, lock in losses, and capitalize that loss. So I'm fascinated by building portfolios that can only do right. Like portions of the portfolio may be volatile, but having something that's stable, accessible being a big, big key that you can touch anytime you want, but give you similar, bond-like returns over time, because that allows you to stay more fully invested. And a good example of that is, if people love 529 plans to save for college, right? It's a great tax advantage. You might get a state tax deduction. It's going to grow tax deferred. You can use it for college tax free. But the advantage is that you can invest and maybe do better than traditional savings. But if you're going to take all that risk off the table, all that upside potential in those years right before college, like what did you really get? What did you really get out of that account? So having other assets that are accessible, that you can touch, can allow you to weather those.
Yeah, and I think that it's hard when we're being optimistic. Like, okay, how much risk am I willing to take? People think they're willing to take a lot of risk in good times. Mm-hmm. They don't feel the same way when they're losing money.
Right.
So we have this like artificial framework of like, okay, I'm willing to take risk, but then when those risks turn into losses, we change our mind or have a different feeling about it. And unfortunately, a lot of that's like a sinking feeling, a feeling of guilt and shame, a feeling of like lowers confidence.
Yeah.
And we don't have enough compassion for what we're going to feel like 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road from the choices we make today.
Right.
And I'm going, look, I know that I'm going to make other financial mistakes. It's just part of being alive. Now, I have a really clear framework and philosophy, protecting the downside, focusing on cash flow, how I invest only aligned with my investor DNA, that I don't invest in real estate unless it's a store of value, that I invest specifically in intellectual property, that I look at businesses that I have ownership in and influence over. Like I have a very specific philosophy. And when I do go outside of that philosophy, it's because I do give a little bit of leeway for speculation. Mm-hmm. But that speculation hasn't really been something that's paid off in my life. It's like a game at best. And sometimes I'm like, I think I'd be better off just sticking to what I know and not taking that really small amount and speculating with it. But I do end up learning lessons from that.
Right.
It's that often we're told these stories that are not real. And then we buy into hope as if wealth is something that just happens because we are in the right time at the right place and we hand the money over and we got the Tesla stock earlier, the Apple stock earlier, we bought Bitcoin when it first came out. And so like we get these stories that make us feel behind, that start to create this level of like we're missing out. And so we buy into the next story that has a similar tune but might not be real at all.
Right.
And can easily derail us and distract us. So if you are the type of person that you recognize your personality might be that you would do those things, saying, where can you have something that never fails you? Where can you have something that's stable, secure, accessible? Where could you have something that's protected from liability? Where could you have something that you could store your cash and it isn't going to just get decimated by inflation? And for me, that place, since I was 18 years old, well, when I was 18, I bought, let's just make fun of me, I bought a variable universal life policy. Mm-hmm. $70 a month, minimum funded, right?
Yep.
Like almost all paying for cost of insurance, not enough going to cash value. They showed me 18% a year for 40 years. I was going to be a multimillionaire off of $70 a month. And it was not possible because I did a Monte Carlo simulations on it. I did an econometrics class, did a thesis on it, and found out not only would it not work, it had a 97.8% chance of failure.
Right.
So thankfully, I learned that and then was taught through this program called LEAP about whole life and how whole life could work and how it would stabilize. And so fortunately, when I was 19 years old, I started my first policy that I still have today. I'm almost on 30 policies now. Now some people think like, why do you have so many policies? Because when you start that young and you don't have much money, you start a policy and you can't just up the death benefit the next day on the policy. You get a new policy. That's just how the thing works.
Yeah.
And then I have it on my kids and on my wife and on people that I had business relationships with where it was instrumental.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't even have a savings account. I technically do, but there's been $0 in it for about 15 years. Because why would I? When I have substantial, cash values that are going up, I do the analysis each year. It's going up at about 5.5%.
Really?
Riskless and taxless each year.
How old are the policies that are going up 5.5?
About 15 years.
So there's a real efficiency on the other side of year 10.
Yeah.
Maybe it's year 13 where it really transitions typically?
I like to break it into two phases.
Okay.
So usually as early as year 4 or 5, your policy is growing at significant interest rates, but you're still behind a little bit if you
because that first year you have. I mean, they have to put money in reserves.
Yeah.
With your first year.
So generally speaking, the funding phase or the break-even phase on a traditional whole life policy is 8 to 12 years. You can overfund them and you can make that happen sooner. But I like to break it into phases. Like that's the funding phase. Like this is not your 5-year money. This is not your 5-year money. This is not your. I say there's saving and then there's deferred spending. Like this is not you save up for 2 years to then buy a house. This is actually your ongoing allocation to that safety net. So there's the funding phase, that's the break-even phase, but then usually 10 years plus, these policies will be growing at 80 to 90% of their stated dividend interest rate net. So if they say it's a 6% dividend, you'll get 5 to 5.5 depending on the policy. And that's the key. That's what you're doing it for, is you're giving your future self that gift of an asset that gives you bond-like performance, but with none of the risk. The insurance company has completely absorbed all of that risk from you and given you additional guarantees with death benefits and stuff on top of that.
Guaranteed minimum interest rate. Once the dividend's paid, it becomes guaranteed. The death benefit's guaranteed.
I don't want to skip over that. Everyone forgets that. When you look at these illustrations, it'll say non-guaranteed all over it. And that's the legal department saying this is not guaranteed. And that's true. Dividends are not guaranteed. They've been paid since Civil War times for all these big mutuals. So in reality, it's coming. The non-guaranteed component is the rate at which it comes.
Yeah.
But everyone overlooks that. It's not like the stock market's not guaranteed, where your account can be worth $1 million one day and then $500,000 the next day.
Right. Like I could perceive that I'm buying Enron stock and it's valuable, and the next day it's worth nothing because it's just a secondary market,
right,
where I'm agreeing to buy a share from someone. Yep. There isn't cash reserve sitting in an account to say, oh, there's that share. It's just a secondary market of what do I believe it's worth.
Right.
And it's a pure agreement of what I believe it's worth.
Yeah.
So it could be worth nothing the next day because it just depends on what I could sell it for.
Right.
When you have cash value, there is an actual asset backing that up at the insurance company. That's very different than a stock.
And once you receive that non-guaranteed dividend, that non-guaranteed
becomes guaranteed.
It becomes guaranteed moving forward. So it's a ratchet effect. So even worst case scenario, the company, goes out of business 40 years down the road for something we can't foresee. All that stuff you got in the past is still rock solid guaranteed, still all yours. It doesn't go to zero like it would in an Enron or a company that goes out of business.
Right. So there's a few layers on that. One, there's the guarantee life associations, which are state by state. Mm-hmm. Has Massachusetts ever paid a claim? There's been zero in Utah.
I don't know.
So it's never been tapped into in the state of Utah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, traditionally what's happened when a major life insurer fails is those state guarantee associations actually work with other insurers to figure out the acquisition and have the other big insurers absorb that risk and absorb that block of business.
So your risk there is you don't know what the dividends might be moving forward, but they're going to honor the cash values in the plan and the guarantees moving forward. And they just acquired a book of business without having to pay commissions. Yeah,
and that's the idea. I mean, it's important that people understand this is not FDIC insurance. These, technically speaking, these are individual institutions.